Good afternoon. Welcome to this Global Forum. Today is the inaugural event, the Global Forum. This forum is designed to discuss, address contemporary issues around the world, and also issues that are pertinent to our global awareness and globalism on campus. So I'm particularly delighted, and it's my pleasure to introduce our president, Samuel Stanley, to give opening remarks.
Well, thank you so much, and it's great to be here. I'm really pleased that Stony Brook has launched this Global Forum. I do see it as actually a platform for students, faculty, and staff to assemble and address some of the critical global issues that face us. Stony Brook is an international university. We are a global presence in this educational environment and have impact around the world. And I think about our campus in Korea. I think about the work we're doing in Madagascar through Central Valbaya, the work we're doing in Kenya through the Turkana Basin Institute. And I think about our many alums and graduates who are making contributions around the world in many different fields. So we export our knowledge and talent from Stony Brook University. At the same time, we import knowledge and talent as well. We have 4,430 international students at Stony Brook, graduate and undergraduates. It's a significant part of our population, and they make wonderful contributions to what we do at the university on a day-to-day basis. So celebrating our global presence and emphasizing the importance of being a global university is very important, and I see the Global Forum as helping us do that as we go forward. So I want to thank June Liu, the Vice Provost and Dean for International Academic Programs and Services, for initiating this. We're going to have between 4 and 6 events per year. June has shared the planned schedule with me, and I think it looks great. But the idea, again, is to emphasize a global campus and make sure global voices are heard on our campus. Among the next events, I'm particularly interested in one that will deal with study abroad. I've created something called the Council of Student Advisors. This is a group that are selected by faculty and students who advise the President's Office on critical issues. Last year they talked about class availability and scheduling of classes. This year they're talking about study abroad. And I'm looking forward to their recommendations on how we can improve the study abroad experiences for all of our students. So this inaugural event, of course, today is very timely. Some of you yesterday may have been there when Baroness Jay, the Right Honorable Baroness Jay of Paddington, member of the House of Lords of England, politician and broadcaster, came and spoke about the election. And she had a very unique perspective on it, speaking about it from the perspective of someone from the United Kingdom who had been following the Brexit issue as well as others. Today we're going to hear from a very different set of experts, our own faculty. And that's fantastic. So it's always great to hear from our faculty. In my State of the University message, I talked about this group and how they had been cited more than 1,000 times in news reports. Their expert commentary had been cited more than 1,000 times in news reports about the election, with hundreds of millions of hits and registers from those commentaries. So we really are going to hear from experts today, so I want to thank Wolf Schaefer, first of all, the director of the Institute for Global Studies, for organizing and moderating our panel today. And I also want to thank Professors Helmut Northhoff, Michael Bernhard, Stanley Feldman, Leonie Huddy, and Yana Krupnovkov, who are serving on the panel and are going to talk about the upcoming election, and maybe actually, at least one of you, predict what they think the results will be. So as a global university, this event, of course, is important to the United States, but of course it's important to the rest of the world as well, this upcoming election. I think many have said there's never been an election perhaps more important for the country. So it'll be very interesting to hear, and I really envy you the opportunity to hear all of their expert comments. So with that, I want to thank you again for coming to this initial event. I think it's going to be an amazing discussion, and best of luck to all the panelists. And you and the audience who join this event, the first of what will be many exciting events as part of the Global Forum. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President Stanley. As President Stanley said, that the Global Forum is going to happen every 3 to 4 times each semester. And we're going to focus on global landscape, such as Madagascar, TBI, Italy, Russia, and soon in Korea. We're also going to discuss pertinent issues about our student success from international population. So please stay tuned and check our website of Office of Global Affairs. We are going to start today. It's my great honor to introduce our very own Professor Wolf Schaeffer, Director of Institute of Global Studies, to moderate this session. Without further ado, please join us, welcome.
So welcome again to the Global Forum of the Office of Global Affairs. Its Institute for Global Studies has organized this discussion. The Institute studies global consequences of local events and investigates how global phenomena impact local contexts. We understand the American presidential election as a global-local event. And this is not only our local perception. The world is watching the American election, literally. My friends Wolfgang and Ivo in Berlin, for example. They and many others in Europe set their alarm clocks to 3 a.m., got up in the middle of the night when it was 9 p.m. here, and watched our presidential debates in real time. People all over the world are following this election cycle with great trepidation. Yesterday, President Stanley called it the most important election of our lifetime. He was introducing Margaret Jay's lecture on the new populism in America and Britain. Brexit, Baroness Jay's reference point, was an ominous local global event. It was unexpected and should not have happened, but it did happen on June 23. So just imagine for a minute that Donald Trump is elected President of the United States on November 8. What will happen come 2017? Mr. Trump's dark threat in the second debate, I quote, "If I win, I'm going to instruct my Attorney General to get a special prosecutor to look into your situation," end of quote, could lead to the unprecedented imprisonment of an American candidate for president. Governor Chris Christie, jockeying for the Attorney General appointment in a Trump administration, already indicated at the Republican National Convention in July that he wants to present the case on the facts against Hillary Clinton to a jury of her peers. The attending crowd shouted, "Lock her up." Hearing this and imagining Trump in power, I saw the new populists joining hands with the old populists. As someone who has come to the US from Germany, where unmistakable words were also once taken lightly and discounted as mere rhetoric, I too do think that we are approaching the most important election of our lifetime. The challenge to the American democracy is real, and our speaker and 4 panelists have agreed to discuss that challenge. Please give them a round of applause. Thank you. Political science professor Helmut Norpoth will start the discussion with his election model that has predicted that Donald Trump will win the election. Then our 4 distinguished and widely published panelists will offer their insights. First, political science professor Leonie Huddy, an expert on gender and politics. Second, political science professor Stanley Feldman, expert on authoritarianism. Third, history professor Michael Barnhart, expert on American foreign policy. And fourth, political science professor Jana Kopnikov, an expert on political partisanship and participation. Professor Norpoth will speak for 15 minutes, each panelist for 10 minutes, and then we go into open discussion. Helmut, please.
Thank you. thank you very much for this introduction, and thank you, the Institute for Global Studies, for inviting me to speak to you, and thank you all for coming. My punchline already has been given away, but you may have heard about it anyway. Donald Trump is predicted, according to my model, to win the presidency this year. And I knew the moment I arrived at this forecast in February that it sounded as outlandish, as ludicrous, and maybe as delusional as anything coming out of the mouth of the candidate himself. I mean, he would be somebody to say that, I'll win. So I want to make very clear, I'm not paid by Mr. Trump. I don't work for him in any capacity. I think my only contact with him has been a tweet from him about my forecast, which he certainly liked, but that's it. So I like to say, the way people who write novels put it in a disclaimer, that any resemblance between my prediction and my preference is purely coincidental. So this is not something I do out of political campaigning. It's something I do as my profession, and so for me to do it right, to do it without fudging anything is very important. So, but I know that, okay, this thing works, all right, that this is causing a lot of people some trepidation. Maybe that's a mild term for putting it. Many people say, oh, I've heard about it, I hope you're wrong. And what is it that I've done to make this kind of a forecast? What kind of rationale, what kind of model, ideas have gone into this to do that? I started doing this kind of election forecasting about 25 years ago. It started sort of almost as a lark. A student of mine in a class that the student had taken with me wrote me a letter after the election. And the student said, based on something I learned in your course, I lost $50 on a bet. And she proceeded to tell me what bet she had lost and why. And as I was reading that, I thought to myself, well, at least I'm very proud that you remember what you learned in my class, even though it turned out to be wrong. And so I wrote it back. I said, yes, I'm very proud that you remembered something, even though it didn't turn out well. And just to make you feel better, I did the same thing. I lost actually literally $50 on the same bet as well. Well, that was in the early 90s. And so this was not based on any kind of a model that I had used, just something off the top of my head. So I thought to myself, and I knew some of my colleagues, none of them on this panel, who had done forecasting, and I wanted to do something that was different, that's something they had not done. And I have a little training in statistics and working with data over time, called time series data. And so I thought, well, what if I just did this and looked at past elections to see whether past elections will tell us anything about the future. I was surprised that nobody had ever done that. And so, very simple data set, presidential elections in the past, 100, 150 years, and lo and behold, something turned up. Something of a cycle that I had not been aware of and I had not seen in the literature. Give you a little idea about what that cycle was like. Let's compare what happens to the party that is in the White House after one term and after two terms. So I'm going to go pretty quickly right here. So you have a win, a win, a win, oops, a loss, a win, another win. So in the last sort of 70 years, when the presidential party has been in the White House for one term, it almost always wins, often with the person who is in office, but that's not happening. The vice president, 1980, Jimmy Carter, is a real exception to the rule. On the other hand, when you look at two terms, all right, I'm sorry, 2012 fits as well. So, loss, here's a win. All right, we can argue about that. 2000, controversial election, loss, Question mark. All right, so this is what we're in, 2016. Obama has been in office for 2 terms. He cannot run for a 3rd term. The Constitution forbids it. Somebody else has to run. So is that other Democrat who succeeded Hillary Clinton, what are her prospects? Well, based on that, you would say not too good. All right, many of these elections are close, but the tendency is that you're going to lose. All right, now that's just 70 years. Over a longer period of time, and this is one of the things about American elections, is you can really go back quite a while. It's almost 200 years of election history of the share of one of the major parties, the Democratic Party, out of the popular vote. All right. You can almost trace with your finger a number of cycles, and there are about 11 cycles. American election, presidential election, run in cycles. And you can also see right now, the cycle is on a, on a downswing. All right, it's not pointing up, it's pointing down to what, 50% and maybe below. This is the kind of data that I analyzed with some statistics, which some of you will learn a little bit after beyond 201 or something like this. It's a very simple equation, actually, that captures that. Vote in one election based on the previous and the one before. The big point right here about a cycle is this. You have a negative sign for the vote 2 elections down the line. So whatever you got 2 elections past is going to be reversed right now. And so if you got a lot in that election, you might get a big reversal. And so for 2016, Obama won pretty convincingly in 2008, beating McCain. He also won against Romney, but by only about half the margin. So you can say what is happening is hope and change. Okay, it was a powerful message in getting him in, but after 4 years, it still was okay, but it wasn't the kind of thing that was expanding, where people said resoundingly, okay, that's great, I give him a landslide victory the second time. It was a pretty close election, polls were very close even until the end, etc. So based on that, working out these statistics, which you can almost do with a paper and pencil, all right, you get this prediction of the 2-party vote. Just on the cycle. No Donald Trump involved in the picture yet. Republicans poised to win by this margin. No, it's not a big margin, but it is. The tendency is, the tilt is toward that party. Now, it's not a high certainty. It's not something like 90%, which some other forecasts are making. But it's better than 50-50. So, what can I do about the election right now? What kind of information do I have about the current contest to give me a little bit more precision to make a forecast? And so this is also something I pondered about 25 years ago. I was looking at other forecasts, what they were using, when they used the economy, presidential approval, etc. So I said, okay, let me do something different. And so, as many of you know who take classes on American election campaigns, etc., we have primaries. Americans have presidential primaries. And it may come as a surprise to some of you that we have had primaries for actually quite a while. Okay, you recognize these guys, right? Woodrow Wilson, William Howard Taft, 1912. We've had presidential primaries for 100 years. That's quite a good long period to do something with. And something very interesting happened in the battle between, well, before these guys got the nomination in the primaries, that I don't think anybody had noticed at the time. I looked at the New York Times archive, didn't see any article about that. 1912, William Howard Taft, the Republican nominee, actually was a loser in the primaries. All right, as you can see, the number right here, he lost to a rival who I think most of you can guess, right? his own next-door neighbor, Oyster Bay, Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt beat Taft in the primary battles. There were about a dozen primaries, and so that was the outcome. Teddy Roosevelt, winner of primaries, but the party turned its back on him, didn't give him the nomination, because he had been two-term president, so he would have actually run then for a third term, practically speaking. They stuck with Taft, who was a president and probably had enough clout with the party regulars and those that states that didn't have primaries to put him over the top. All right, on the Democratic side, you can see Woodrow Wilson, all right, professor of politics, only member of our profession who made it into the presidency, was the winner against a rival whose name I always forget. He was not a Teddy Roosevelt, but anyway. So, you have a very simple rule right now. You see, the party that nominates the primary winner against the party that nominates the primary loser, the one with the primary winner wins the general election. Woodrow Wilson was elected president in 1912. And, as you can see, this is just a sampling of other elections. It's pretty much true in those as well. And if you have both candidates being primary winner, then you have to look at who is the stronger one, who is getting sort of the bigger share of the vote. And so in terms of the numbers that I use, this will be some illustration about how the support in primaries relative to your strongest opponent correlates with the vote in the general election. For these elections since 1912, it's a pretty strong relationship. It's not perfect. Some points are a little bit off the line. And I can also do this for the opposition party candidate. That's one of the nice things about it. If you want to make a forecast of a presidential election, you'd like to have information about both candidates, not just about one or about some broad condition like the economy, etc., from which you have to infer that maybe such and such is happening. Here I have information about the strength of these candidates, both on the incumbent side and on the opposition party side. And so these are the numbers that you see sort of depicted here, which I put into a formula, along with the cycle, the pendulum, which is the last election and the election before. Okay, before I get that, I have to make one more sort of digression into the primaries. Time is up?
2 minutes.
2 minutes, okay. Put another gear, okay. All right. New Hampshire has been a very important primary to me for the last 3 or 4 elections. I've only used New Hampshire for reasons that we can go through right now quickly, unfortunately. But I've also, for this election, and so I've tweaked my model, I've added another one, South Carolina. The first in the South, because New Hampshire, as you may expect, does not have a large number of African Americans. So a candidate like Hillary Clinton or like Obama in 2008, whose campaign rests a lot on that, is absent in New Hampshire. South Carolina makes up for that. So what I've decided in this election to combine New Hampshire and South Carolina to give me a measure of primary strength. And what's happening right here, as you can see very quickly, all right, Donald Trump was the winner in both of these. On the other side, you have Sanders and you have a split verdict on the Democratic side. So the Democratic candidate, ultimately nominee Hillary Clinton, does not have the kind of strength in the primary, according to my metric, as Donald Trump. So Donald Trump has this, she has 56. All right, and so now you can know what's coming. All right, I have the cycle, okay, tilts toward Republicans. I have the primaries, tilts toward Trump. And so it's almost mathematically impossible now, according to my model, not to come up. This is sort of the dirty details, the formula that lets you sort of reconstruct what I'm doing. So I'm putting it on the table. It's published on my website. If you're interested in verifying it. And so, drum roll please. So, all right, between those two, my prediction is this. Donald Trump 52.5, Hillary Clinton 47.5, and using a little bit of other statistics, translating the error of the model into a probability, this is where I come up with my 87% chance of winning. That's a model, all right. Look good in, well, I don't know, look good at any time given the polling, but that's it. Now, some of you may say, and I'm sure my panelists will point this out, some drawbacks. So I'm eager to hear what they have to say. Thank you.
Well, I think I'm here to tell you a different story. And I must say my story is based more on looking at the makeup of the electorate and reading the tea leaves, which is otherwise known as the public opinion polls. But we should also add that there are sometimes discontinuities in a timeline or record, and Helmut's model has worked very well, and we're looking at a very unusual election. So what I want to talk about is an election that is unusual because we have a woman running for presidency. Sometimes this fact is obscured. I think it's being brought into sharper relief with some recent developments. But what I wanted to say is that typically for the President of the United States, there are barriers to getting elected. I've been studying gender and politics for a very long time, and what typically we would say is that women candidates face obstacles that they can overcome, but that are particularly powerful when you're running for a high-level executive office like the presidency, which involves all of what we typically think of as masculine characteristics. And I should add, I know many of you probably come from perhaps parliamentary democracies, where women have more readily gained leadership positions because they're typically put there by their peers. They're not subject to a direct vote to the entire population. That makes a difference. And so when I'm talking about this, I'm thinking about both subtle and more blatant forces that affect how we judge people based on their gender. Sometimes we're unaware of these factors, sometimes we're aware of them. When we think about women running for political office, some of the factors and barriers that they confront is that automatically men are typically attributed with stronger leadership qualities. Research shows this when people are asked to judge whether someone is leader-like. Women just don't quite look like leaders in the way that men do, to ordinary people. I'm speaking here about the public. When we've done research on this, there's often a better match between the characteristics that people automatically ascribe to women for what we would call legislative office, that's writing laws, not necessarily executive office like the presidency, where that person is the sole decision maker. Women are thought to be better, more cooperative, so they would be good in a legislature, but perhaps not so great as the sole leader. We've certainly seen a lot of deficits in our research on, without much information, people would think that women will not be as effective in handling military and foreign policy issues. Now I'm going to come back to Hillary Clinton. Obviously, she has worked particularly hard to overcome some of these perceptual barriers or biases. We've also seen that women are thought better at handling domestic policy issues and not so much foreign affairs. One of the things that I was writing about before the first debate is that it's very important for women to smile. You may have noticed if you were watching both debates, the first one in particular, that Hillary Clinton smiled a lot. Well, the research shows that women aren't seen to be as persuasive or effective if they're not smiling. This is not something that's used to judge men. So if you're wondering why she smiled so much in that first debate, that's why. And I'll add as an aside that when we've studied, and this is for those of you who take political science classes or maybe any classes, women's evaluations as instructors also get rated more down if they're not rated nice. It doesn't affect men's ratings. So I'm just reminding you that this happens in class. But obviously women can win political office. And what I want to say is that women candidates are usually pretty aware of what these barriers are. So I'd say in the case of Clinton, if we just look at a recent CBS poll, who would be better at handling foreign policy? Normally, if we don't know much about the candidates, we'd say, well, it probably would be the guy. But because she has been Secretary of State, and we've seen her traveling around the world, voters think, well, she would probably be better. And of course, we have the Donald Trump effect over here. who would be better at handling terrorism. I got a lot of questions. I spent some time in Australia earlier this year, and people said, well, of course, a terrorist attack, that would benefit Donald Trump, right? Not necessarily, especially if he's considered something of a wild card when it comes to foreign policy. So even on the question of handling terrorism, Clinton is rated up. And this is a recent poll, just done very recently. Although before, I think, well, no, just, it was done before, after the first debate, before the recent events. And who would be the stronger leader, Clinton? Now, so it looks like, in my view, what she's done is worked hard to overcome what would be the automatic deficits that a woman confronts. And she's done it through hard slog work by holding these positions. Does it mean that gender is not at play in this election? I don't know how many of you've seen of these. These are bumper stickers that have sometimes a very nasty but continually gendered tone. As you look at this, it is about physical appearance. It's the B word. We've got Bill Clinton. You know, we've got all sorts of ugly, but all about her as a woman, right? Now, these are on the Trump side. These are Trump supporters, but you have to say that gender is incredibly relevant to this election. There are people who are very exercised, in addition to everything else, about her as a woman, and a particular kind of woman, a powerful woman, a woman who's held positions of authority. So that's on the Trump side. I'd say that it is largely confined to that. People have looked to see, maybe some of you saw this among the Bernie bros, was there very nasty tweets going around, and it looked like it was largely coming from the Trump supporters. So this kind of very negative gendered slamming of Hillary. But what I'd also like to add is that despite what you hear, there is some, what I call feminist enthusiasm for Clinton. And I don't confine this to women. In research that I've done and looking at things like, do you think that we have problems with gender discrimination in the United States? And do you think that we should have more women in politics? More women than men, but plenty of men agree with that. And they sort in terms of whether they're Democrats or Republicans. So what I say is, yes, we have a gender gap, but we have an even bigger feminist gap. And we have women who are opposed to these ideas who are much more likely to be Republicans. So it's not just about being male or female. It's your view of the relationships between men and women in our society and whether you think we should equalize power relations and deal with issues of discrimination. So what I wanted to point out to you is that in the same recent CBS poll, the question was asked, how glad are you that the woman is running for president? And this is among women registered voters. You can see there's a lot of enthusiasm among Democrats, but also a majority of independent women. That's important. So there's quite a lot of enthusiasm there, and some, but less on the Republican side. So this is a factor. And there was also a question of how good would it be for women if Hillary Clinton was elected? So if you look at the first graphic up there, among women registered voters, again, the same CBS poll, which of these candidates would be better for women? Well, I think it's fairly overwhelmingly clear that the majority of people think Hillary Clinton would be good for women. Donald Trump, perhaps not so much. And then how much does Donald Trump respect women? And I want to point out this is previous. This poll was done before last week's revelations, and that varied somewhat by what party you belong to. Republicans are defending him and say a lot or some. Democrats, very few. And again, we're interested in independents because they will be very influential in this election. And a majority of them think not much or not at all. And again, these are women. So I want you to think about these independent women voters. We're seeing them move towards Hillary Clinton in this election. And I also want to point out that while I think the feminist gap is important, we're stuck in our surveys a lot of the time with the gender gap. And I think what we're looking at right now is something of historic proportions. Partly, I think, driven by these independent women moving towards Hillary Clinton and support of her. But in this recent, in a whole bunch of polls, there's a Quinnipiac poll here conducted just recently, again before last week's revelations of the tapes, and a Fox News poll, you can see a dramatic difference in women's support For Hillary Clinton, it's 58% versus 36%. This is a whopping difference. Yes, there are women who support Trump, but nowhere near as many as those who support Hillary Clinton. Similar in a Fox poll. And what I want to show you next is what the country might look like if only women were voting. If you have a look on the left-hand side, those blue states, and if you look at the top, you'll see the Electoral College vote. That means if women only were voting, it's a huge landslide for Hillary Clinton. I mean, she gets 458 of the Electoral College votes. If men are voting, it looks a little different. In fact, we've got a very red map on that side. And so under those circumstances, Trump would win. So this is a very startling looking map. I leave you to draw your own conclusions about this, but it certainly is very different by men and women. So what I'd like to say is, as you can tell, based on these polls, I believe Hillary Clinton will be the next president of the United States. I'm not going out on a limb saying that at this point. What I do believe is that there will be consequences. I think it's odd, frankly, for one political party to champion women and the other to be rather silent on that point. And this goes for the people who are in that party and represent that party. If you look at other European democracies, you'll find women across the parties, across the ideological spectrum. So when we look at the Democratic and Republican parties, we're seeing very, very few women in national elective positions. And I think this trend will continue for the moment. I think it's odd. I think it will change at some future time point because it has to, if parties are vaguely rational. But I think what we're going to see is an even bigger version of this feminist gap between the Democratic and Republican parties. So there'll be people on the Democratic side saying, yes, we have a problem with gender relations. I think it's going to increase activity on gender-related policy issues on the Democratic side to the extent to which these laws can get passed in Congress. You'll see the party talking even more about equal pay provisions, paid family leave. This is not going to subside, it will increase. And I think we'll see even more women running for office on the Democratic side. I think having a woman president breaks a big barrier for the United States. It is historic. It will encourage more women to run for presidency because it's possible for them to win. And someone had to go first. As I said to one reporter, somebody had to do it, and that was Hillary Clinton, who was an extremely well-qualified candidate for this job. So yeah, last point about sexism, will it go away? No. I hate to say this, and I hate to tell you this, but it will not be always so attractive in the coming months. Or years, or whatever we're facing here. I think that she will confront both blatant and subtle sexism. Subtle is probably the more insidious. I'm predicting the launching of Trump Network. For those of you who have been following, that's what I think Donald Trump is thinking about. He's going to start the Trump Network, and I'm sure that she'll be in his crosshairs there. But I also have some faith in her. I think of her as practicing cocktail diplomacy. She's said very many times, you know, what we need is to have a drink with the generals. I'm going to get those Republicans together, and we're going to have cocktails in the White House. So keep your eye out also for cocktail diplomacy. Thank you.
There we go. Okay. So it's great to be here. We only just focused in on Hillary Clinton and her historic candidacy, and I want to talk about the other side of the equation, Donald Trump. And what I want to do is spend a few minutes and just have us think about what we should learn from this year's campaign. And from Donald Trump's victory in the Republican primaries and his campaign for the presidency. So I think, as Leonie mentioned, that if you look at the polling coming out now, that it's likely that Trump is going to lose the election on November 8th. And it's going to be easy to afterwards to attribute that to his 3 a.m. tweets, to his conflicts with a few former beauty contest winner, to his temperament, to the tape that came out on Friday from Access America. And while I don't want to dismiss those as being important factors, I do want to say that if that's the only thing that we focus in on, we're going to miss something very important about what's happened this year. So in order to make that point, let me take you back to the primaries. Let's just look at what happened in the Republican primaries, and then I want to say how that suggest how that translates into the general election. First of all, Donald Trump did incredibly well in the Republican primaries. He got, across all the primaries, got just short of 50% of the votes, about 45% of all the votes. And to some extent that was depressed because in the early primaries there were just so many candidates. As the primaries went along, his vote share tended to go up. He ended up with almost 60% of the pledged delegates, roughly 3 times more than his nearest competitor. There's also a tendency to go look at the Republican primaries and say, oh, you know, it turned out that none of the other challengers were very strong, and so he won in a weak field. But it's really hard to say that. Among the contestants when the Republican primaries began were 3 senators, 2 sitting governors, and a former governor whose father and brother happened to be presidents of the United States. Now, if you look at that in comparison to almost any other primary season on the Republican or Democratic sides, you have to say that that's not a weak field. Donald Trump beat a number of credible, strong candidates for the Republican nomination. And so the question is, how did he do that, and what does that tell us? So let me take a look at, very briefly, at what his support looked like. And I'm going to start with some data from the exit polls. I just picked out some representative states to show you on a couple of key questions that were asked in the exit polls, so you can begin to see who his supporters were. So one of the questions that was asked in most of the exit polls is whether or not the voter felt that people who were in the country illegally, migrants who were in the country illegally, should either be given a path to stay in the country or should be deported. And there you see the results from 5 different states. And notice that while Trump supporters in New York were a little less enamored with deporting illegal immigrants, that generally across the contest, between 50 and 60, in some cases more % of Trump supporters thought that was a good idea. The exit polls also asked people how they felt about the federal government. Were they upset? Were they angry? And as you can see, a very substantial proportion of people who voted for Donald Trump in the primaries didn't just say they were upset with the federal government, they said they were angry. And maybe the most diagnostic question in the exit polls, the whole issue of whether that Donald Trump raised on whether or not there should be a temporary ban on Muslims entering the United States. And here you can see something quite amazing. That is, and this I could have shown you 5 or 6 more exit polls and you get exactly the same story. That is basically between 80 and 90% of people who voted for Donald Trump in the Republican primaries said that they endorsed his position on this, that they too supported a temporary ban on Muslims entering the United States. A little bit more evidence. So this doesn't come from the exit polls, but from a survey that was done in February, so in the early stages of the Republican primaries. And I'll just show you a couple of results here. And in this case, we're looking at people who said they had a favorable view. They approved of Donald Trump versus the Republicans who disapproved. So among Republicans in February who said that they approved of Donald Trump, over 70% said they supported airport checks for passengers who appeared to be of Middle Eastern descent to curb terrorism, 7 out of 10. Similarly, among Republicans who approved of Donald Trump, over 3 out of 4 said that they supported using military force over diplomacy against countries that threaten the United States. I could go on, but the point I want to make is that when you look at the surveys that were done, one of the conclusions you have to come to is that Donald Trump didn't win the Republican nomination just because he was famous or outspoken or got a lot of media attention. All of that was important. But the fact is that if you looked at the preferences of the people who supported him, they supported him because of stands he was taking on controversial issues. That is, this was not just a fluke. It was not just someone who capitalized on his celebrity. It was somebody who galvanized a substantial fraction of Republican voters around certain key issues that he emphasized. It was a strong basis of support. Okay. So, what happens to that support when we move from the primaries to the general election? So, one of the widely known dynamics of American politics and American presidential elections is a function of this strange primary election system that we have. It's been known for a very long time that people who vote in Republican primaries tend to be quite conservative. More conservative than the American public as a whole, and even somewhat more conservative than Republican identifiers. People who vote in Democratic primaries also tend to be more toward the left, more liberal than the public as a whole, more liberal than Democrats in general. So if you're going to win the Republican primary, you have to situate yourself in a fairly conservative manner to get the votes of those people who are going to vote in the Republican primaries. Same thing on the other side for Democrat. As soon as you know you've got the nomination, right, the goal is to move towards the center, right? Because now you have to broaden your appeal so that you can win in among the voters, much larger number of voters who are going to vote in November. Right? So the question is, how do you moderate? And for those of you who remember 4 years ago, if you remember the first presidential debate, Obama versus Romney, I can still remember Obama sitting there at that debate, sort of looking incredibly puzzled, like, who is this Mitt Romney who all of a sudden sounds like a very moderate centrist Republican after he ran such a conservative campaign in the Republican primary? That's sort of what generally goes on, right? Candidates try to compete for the center. So let me give you an example of a couple of these positions that I just showed you that generated so much support for Donald Trump in the primary, and what happens when we get to the public as a whole. So what about this ban on Muslims entering the United States? So here's from a survey of the general public. Right? If we just look at Republicans, right, you can see that Republicans as a whole tend to favor this, not quite as much as Trump supporters did in the primaries, but in general they tend to support this along with Donald Trump. But if we now expand it to the rest of the electorate, right, notice that it's incredibly unpopular among Democrats. And perhaps more importantly, right, it is very unpopular among independents, so that overall, right, it's disapproved of by about a 2-to-1 margin. Right? So what was very galvanizing for Donald Trump in the primary among his supporters is in fact an unpopular position among the public as a whole. Second example, right, the wall. Favor building a wall along the Mexican border to stop immigration. Again, popular among Republicans, right? Quite popular among Republicans. What about the rest of the public? Notice not only Democrats disapprove, but again, independents substantially disapprove, so that a second one of the issues that Trump was able to use very effectively to garner support in the primary, in the Republican primary, right, turns out not to be very popular when we look at the voting public as a whole. So one of the things to think about then is in terms of what's happening, and again I want to get away from all of the tweaks and the insults and the like. is to look at part of the dynamic of how Donald Trump was either unwilling or unable, and we could debate that and maybe have to interrogate people closer to him to find that out, but not to do what candidates generally are expected to do, which is to shift back towards the center, right? And you can see that part of the dynamic going on here is someone who ran very effectively in the Republican primaries and perhaps not so effectively in the general election. Okay, so just a couple of last points. So one question that's come up in the last couple of weeks is, given the Access America tape, how far can we expect Donald Trump's support to fall if in fact there are more revelations, things like that. So let me just give you an example. This came from a survey that was done in the late primaries, and Republicans were asked to agree or disagree with this. The worst Republican candidate for president, the worst, is still better than the Democratic candidates, right? 76% of Republicans agreed. 50% strongly agreed, right? Just think about that. The worst Republican candidate. Not very different on the Democratic side, almost identical. Right? So part of what you have to understand about dynamics of this election is the extent to which the Democrats and Republicans are just unwilling to consider voting for anyone from the other party, no matter who their candidate is. I just want to point out, I just found this morning. This is a survey that was done after the tape came out on Friday, which everybody thought was going to be so damaging for Donald Trump. And it asked people whether or not they thought it was an important issue or just a distraction. And the interesting thing is among people who had been Donald Trump supporters at this point, almost 95%, 94% said it was just a distraction. Right? It was the Hillary Clinton supporters who said it was an important issue. So in that sense, there is a solid basis of support there for Donald Trump. A good core of Republican voters are not going to give up on him. And basically, we are in a period of extreme partisan polarization. This campaign is certainly not helping, but that also is important to understand the dynamics of what's happening here. Thank you.
Historians, as a rule, are not very fond of models, and particularly predictive ones. And I'll tell you a personal story to illustrate that fact. Back in the last century, when I was in graduate school, during my first year, it was a very exciting time to be a historian of American politics. We were figuring out for the first time that while we had had this immense amount of data for presidential elections, really down to the county-by-county level, and had it for a long time, there were these new things called computers that we could use to sift through that data and try to discern patterns. And the immediate assignment that my class was given by our professor was to start sifting through that data for the 1850s, which seemed to be a particularly important time because it witnessed the creation of the Second American Party system, the collapse of the Whig Party, the rise of the modern Republican Party. So that was our task for the semester. We all got very busy. Our chief obstacle seemed to be to convince the natural scientists to actually give us some computer time, which was quite rare and costly back in those days. But we finally cracked the code, and we finally got one variable that quite reliably predicted the percentage of the Democratic vote throughout the 1850s. And we could use that to figure out what happened to the Whigs, why the Republicans so successful. Well, the one variable that turned out to be predictive was the number of sawmills per county. Yeah, you heard right. The number of sawmills per county. So our professor looked at us after we, eager beavers presented this report, and he said, okay, now tell me why. Why was the number of sawmills so predictive for the Democratic Party vote? Well, that was impossible for us to answer, and if any of you want to tackle that in your doctoral dissertations, please let me know, and I'll be happy to sponsor that sort of thing. But it led us to wonder, well, just how useful was this entire exercise. But in a way, it was useful because it highlighted, and something that Professor Feldman sort of talked about in his presentation, the two modes that parties, since the creation of that second party system, have used to attempt to win presidential elections. And those two modes are pretty easy to explain. One mode that was dominant throughout most of the 19th century was a mobilization mode. What you wanted to do was not to identify your supporters, they had already identified themselves. It was almost unheard of for someone to switch party affiliation in the 19th century. Party affiliation was about as attached to you as your religion, for example. So the name of the game was to mobilize your supporters. You had to get them out to the polls through whatever means necessary, the most inventive of which was the log cabin campaign of 1842, where everybody that showed up got a jug of whiskey. An effective mobilization technique. But the party who could mobilize, which could mobilize the greater number of its voters, was the one that more times than not would be able to win any given contest at the local, state, or national level. That changed by the end of the 19th century, when a new mode of trying to win elections came in part inspired by changes brought on by the corporatization of American society, when a certain candidate figured out that you could use, he didn't have to campaign himself, he could use advertising. He could use pamphlets and modern media. They didn't have radio or TV back then, but the newspapers and magazines could be used plenty. And he attempted to win the election through a strategy of inclusivity, that is moving toward the middle, trying to disaggregate party allegiances, trying to appeal to people that had not traditionally been members of his party. And it was a very interesting election because it was the election of 1896. Very interesting because of the uncanny parallels to the election of 2016. In the 1896 contest, we had a candidate on the Democratic side, William Jennings Bryan, who was an insurgent candidate. He had very little experience in national office. In fact, he was a very young man. Ran for president when he was 45. Against a very seasoned legislator, William McKinley, who had been in Congress for years, was an acknowledged policy wonk. They wouldn't have used that phrase back then, but that's what he was. An expert on the tariff, a master of the various factions of the Republican Party. The country was in deep trouble. There had been a terrible depression in 1893 that still had not been conquered by the 1896 election. A lot of Americans out of work, a lot of angry Americans, and Bryan tapped that wellstone. He presented himself as the candidate of the angry Americans, the candidate of the Americans who wanted to overthrow the system, get rid of all the elites, just like William McKinley. Gave tremendous speeches, very effective use of media, the most famous of which was his speech, "You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold," deliberate attack on the American banking system. McKinley, by contrast, almost never spoke directly, which was good because he wasn't a very good speaker. He used advertising, he used surrogate campaigns, he appealed deliberately to the middle. He tried this new strategy of inclusivity that in some respects was all too successful. You see presidential turnout, which had been very high through the 19th century, declining quite substantially through the 20th century as both parties would come to embrace this strategy of inclusivity. But it's a kind of clear case of a clash between these two. Now, I'm not going to predict how 2016 is going to turn out, but I will tell you how 1896 turned out, because that's in the province of historians, after all. McKinley destroyed Bryan in the 1896 election. It was a landslide, and for McKinley, that was very good news. The bad news was that Bryan came back and would run again in 1900, and yet again after that. But McKinley would beat him again in 1900. So make of that what you will. That's one lesson of history that I'll leave you with. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you so much for having me here. And I have to say, it's actually, as somebody who studies political participation, it's kind of inspiring to see so many people show up to talk about politics because it seems to so rarely happen. And you also all seem to be excited to be here, which makes you different from the general American public in 2016, who are actually really upset about this election. So, if we look at polls about how people feel about the campaign, nobody is excited about anything. the modal emotions that people feel are anxiety and fear. If you were to ask Clinton supporters, how would you feel if Clinton won? Only 25% said they would be excited. The majority said they would be relieved. If you were to ask Trump supporters, how would you feel if your candidate won? Only 28% say they would be excited. The majority report they would feel relieved. Now, this is actually kind of different from anything that's happened before. If we were to look at 2012, 50% of Obama supporters said they would be excited if he won, and actually 50% of Romney supporters also will be excited about Romney, which might be shocking to some. So, what makes this election different? It's an election that's really devoid of any positive emotion. So with that, kind of thinking about this really negative election, I kind of want to talk about what happens after this is over. Because no matter who wins, no matter if Helmut is right, we're all going to have to pick up the pieces of what happens in November. So what are those pieces going to be? So I think the first thing to think about is the immediate future, and that's 2018. That's the next time we all get to vote. So no matter what happens in 2016, I think we can anticipate a backlash in 2018. Political scientist Dan Hopkins just recently wrote that whoever loses in 2016 is going to get a big consolation prize in 2018. So what does that mean? It means that we typically in politics see swings against the party of the president during the midterm. People vote for the president, realize they've made a huge mistake, and try to remedy it, essentially in the midterm election. So we see a giant swing. In a case where nobody is excited about the two major party candidates running for office, we might see even more of that in 2018. We might see somebody get what Hopkins calls that consolation prize. Okay, that's fine. But what happens to the two parties? The question that I think is most often asked in the media is, what happens to the Republican Party after Trump? Is Trump basically the death of the Republicans? I'm going to suggest that the death of the Republican Party has been greatly exaggerated. Why is that the case? First of all, American people often have really short memory spans. They have short memory spans in terms of candidates and in terms of who's running for office. So, if the Republicans maneuver correctly, they might overcome the Trump candidacy. Now, the key here is if the Republicans maneuver correctly. That is, if they are able to reach out to their more traditional base of voters. But I think the key question is Trump's candidacy the cause of the issues of the Republican Party, or is it merely a symptom of something that's been brewing for a really long time? In other words, is that Trump might not have caused splinters in the Republican Party, he's just merely what happens when long simmering problems come to a boil. The party is going to have to address the reality that there is a tremendous sense of disagreement in its ranks. There are disagreements about the goals of the party, and there's disagreement about the tactics the party uses. So I'm actually really glad that Stanley talked about this tendency of the candidate to move toward the middle in the general election. There's also another tendency, and that's the tendency for a party to coalesce around a particular nominee, and that nominee is generally a long-standing traditional member of the party. That the Republicans could not coalesce around a nominee that was a long-term member of the party is incredibly telling. That the Republican elites could not coalesce around somebody who would adopt traditional politics is incredibly telling. It's suggestive of the fact that you have one set of people who want to follow traditional political roadways, traditional campaigns. You have another set of people that want a much more extreme approach. They want the Republican Party to fight for them, and they want the party to take signaling strong positions, even if those positions mean accomplishing nothing. The key for the Republican Party then in the future is to figure out how to harness the intense emotions of some of its members and to translate this emotion into participation without splintering or becoming the party of extremists. Now, in this election, we've spoken of the Democrats as if everything is incredibly rosy for them and things are going A-OK. But the Democrats might also be actually concerned. they were able to coalesce around nominee Hillary Clinton, and she's able to run a fairly normal traditional campaign. But what's particularly notable is that Bernie Sanders got the number of primary voters that he did, especially against a total establishment candidate like Clinton. What is incredibly notable as well is that Sanders harnessed the votes of young people, people who are going to be in the party for a very, very long time. What this suggests, at least to me, is that there is something brewing among the Democrats that's in a way similar to what's happening with the Republicans. There are going to be some people who want more extreme positions. There are going to be some people who want the party to fight and take stands. There are actually groups in both parties who are more comfortable with political gridlock than compromise, if that compromise means giving up some of their political positions. So the question then becomes, are those groups going to be able to drive the party? We already see what happens when you give the power to those groups and their militants. You get candidate Trump. But Sanders' candidacy and his success suggests there's kind of a similar element among the Democrats as well. So I think this election is an incredibly important signal for both parties, regardless of what happens with the electoral outcome. Being not the other side, hatred of the other side will only take you so far. Right? Hatred is only unifying for a brief moment. You kind of have to investigate what brings the members of your party together. And I would argue that there are forces within each party that are pushing the party away from traditional politics, that are pushing both parties toward outsider candidates, and which are pushing both parties toward more extreme positions. What the parties do with it, I think, is going to determine the course of politics. So, as the last person speaking, I could either now filibuster for the remainder of this time. I would rather open it up to you guys in terms of, thank you.